So we're going to start today with a question, kind of an abstract, deep question, but it's an important question, and it is, what do you lose if you have morality without God? So what do you lose if you have some sort of absolute moral framework in your life, like saying that some things are definitely right and other things are definitely wrong, but you don't have God as the basis for that framework? And the reason this question matters is we're looking at Exodus 19 this morning. So, we've been going through Exodus for a while here, and basically Exodus 19 serves as a hinge chapter in the book. It's like the main transition in the story, if you were looking at this from a literary perspective. Because, as you think about it, so far the story has kind of been all over the place, geographically and plot-wise. We started out in Egypt, then we went to Midian, then back to Egypt, the Red Sea, all over the wilderness, all these different places they're camping. They're moving all of the time, basically. But from here on out, the next 22 chapters in Exodus, they all take place at one spot, Sinai, the mountain of God. This is where we are going to camp with the Israelites until the book ends. So obviously, what we see from this structure, where over half of the book takes place at one spot, is that what happens at this spot, at this mountain, is a really, really big deal. And Exodus 19, our hinge chapter this morning, prepares us for what's going to be ahead in the whole rest of the book by showing us in the most vivid, almost frightening detail we have seen yet to this point in the Bible, the terrible glory of the living God. The basis of God's laws is God himself. That's basically the point of this chapter, what I think Moses would want the people reading this, future generations, to get out of it, that the basis of God's laws is God himself. This chapter, it's the prelude to the giving of the law. It's like the intro music to the Ten Commandments and all the other commandments that are going to follow after that. And where the spotlight shines in this chapter is squarely upon the character of God himself. That is who we encounter when we arrive at Sinai, the fierceness of the living God, the God of creation, this God of smoke and fire and trumpets that make the rocks shake. This God whose very self is the standard of all that is right and all that is wrong. That's the point of Exodus 19. So, our question, what then do we lose if we reject that? What do we lose if we just skip to chapter 20 of Exodus without chapter 19? If we skip to the morality without God? The Christian writer, his name is Samuel D. James. He published a really interesting piece asking this question, kind of from a cultural perspective, a few months ago. And what he noticed in our society, as he observed kind of where pop culture was going, discourse on the internet, all of that, is that our culture has not gotten less moral over the last couple decades. It has gotten more moral in a certain sense. It's gotten more black and white about right and wrong, more judgmental, at least in certain ways. This is surprising to him. As he puts it, he says, the emerging millennial interest in justice creates a fascinating dynamic for close observers of American culture. Moral relativism, the deconstruction of all objective truth claims, was sold as the inevitable future just a generation ago. Do you guys remember this? Anything goes would be the way to sum up that philosophy, right? What's good for me may not be good for you. What's wrong for me may not be wrong for you, and that's okay. It's all relative. Do what you want. That's moral relativism in a nutshell. And this, as James notes here, this is where moral theorists thought things were heading like a couple of decades ago. They thought by now we would have, we'd be in the twilight of morality, that by now we will have been have escaped into this age of hedonistic freedom where literally anything goes. However, this is not what has happened in our culture, not by a long shot. As James notes, not only has relativism failed to conquer our cultural landscape, it has been routed, and I would also add replaced, by something close to its opposite. A rigid moral absolutism that launches business boycotts and Twitter shame storms as efficiently as any fundamentalism out there. Have you guys noticed this? He points to several examples just from the recent past, like the public outrage that forced Kevin Hart to withdraw from hosting last year's Oscars awards show. The black and white moral judgment that is inherent in the Me Too movement. You know, that sexual assault is always wrong, period. No matter where and how it happens, that's wrong, our culture would say, black and white. Or the severe moral judgment of people like at the Charlottesville protesters with their Nazi salutes and their tiki torches. That stuff is wrong, most in our culture would say, even evil. And if you participate in or condone these kind of, black and white wrong actions, you will be judged, you will be shamed for your behavior. Now, what is obvious is that this perspective that really prevails in our culture in certain areas, this is not moral relativism. Not by a long shot. This is moral absolutism. This is where we are as a culture right now, and pretty much for everybody, Christian or non-Christian. Some things are definitely right, some things are definitely wrong. I think you ask the average person on the street, they'd probably agree with that. As James puts it, he says, the woke collegian is not less moralistic than his evangelical peer. If anything, they are equally moralistic, but in different directions. For example, my secular millennial friend may ridicule my belief that sex is reserved for marriage, while at the same time advocating affirmative consent policies that do put a significant moral burden on sexual encounters. Not, hey, we're throwing out all the standards of right and wrong in regard to sex, but we are having different standards of right and wrong, and they are black and white. Like, if you have sex with somebody without their consent, that's wrong, plain and simple. No matter the context, that is wrong. Just as rigid and absolute of a standard as, we Christians would have when we say no sex outside of marriage. So the writer's conclusion, stated in the title of the piece, we're all fundamentalists now. We're all fundamentalists. This is our time. This is our culture. So this then is our question. What do you lose if you have morality without God? What if you have Exodus 20, the law, the 10 Commandments, all that stuff, but not Exodus 19, the knowledge of the God who is morality's foundation? Tell you what, it's going to be a little bit of tough sledding today. I know that Lisa back there has like a 20-ounce Mountain Dew. We should have all brought one this morning. We're going to need it. But for now, let's get digging. Exodus 19, verse 1, the covenant preview. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out from the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. Can you feel this anticipation? The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. This little exchange right here is a really big deal in the book of Exodus. Basically, what God is offering, right here, kind of in the form of a preview. What he's offering to the Israelites is a covenant, this formal agreement between two parties. Party A, God. Party B, the nation of Israel. And the Israelites probably, when they heard, when Moses came back down and told them this, they would recognize the sort of offer that was being made to them right away, because the speech that God gives there follows basic conventional covenant format. First, you've got a statement of what God has already done. This is known, formally when you look at other covenants, even in a non-religious context at this time. They usually have this. The king says, "This is what I've done for you in the past," and this is what we see right here in verse 4. "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Really, if this is your first Sunday here and you haven't heard the whole series in the book of Exodus yet, and you're just jumping in right here with us at chapter 19, that's fine, because that verse right there is the summary of the first 18 chapters of the book. In a nutshell, it's the redemption of Israel. It's the salvation of these people by God's power and God's grace. I love that image that's used right there, how I bore you on eagle's wings. It really just emphasizes the total grace of this situation. Not, the Israelites saving themselves through effort or cleverness or even their, religious piety or anything like that. But it's just God swooping down, picking them up and carrying them where they needed to go. That's the story of Exodus so far. I think of how the eagles show up in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and stuff. It's always when those hobbits are at their very most helpless, they're stuck up in trees and there's orcs with torches below, there's nothing else they can do. The eagles show up and carry them away. That is salvation. That's the historical prologue for this covenant. And then the second thing, that the way it follows the formula, is the stipulations. This would be where, kind of the terms of the agreement are stated out. He says, verse 5, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant." So really, two commands sum up these stipulations here: obey and keep. Those are the two key words in this. Those words also let you know what sort of covenant this is right here. It's a two-way covenant. It's a covenant with requirements upon the ruler and upon the people. It's different than the covenant with Abraham. That's a distinction we'll kind of keep in mind as we move forward through the rest of the book of Exodus. And then part 3, you have the promise of blessings. "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Another beautiful promise with some beautiful imagery that God uses. All the earth is mine, he says. Really this is establishing his credibility as ruler with a capital R in this covenant. He's not just ruler of, a nation or a territory. He's ruler of all the earth, all of creation, seen and unseen, the Most High God, the Creator. That's who they're dealing with here. But even though God owns everything, he could have anything that he wants. The cattle on 1,000 hills. He has chosen to make Israel his treasured possession among all peoples. One nation to bear his name, one nation to really be his family on earth. But that does not mean that God's plan is just to, okay, now we're going to ignore everybody else. Just destroy the rest of the world or whatever. No. He's got a bigger plan in mind, just like he previewed in that covenant with Abraham back in the book of Genesis, that through Israel, all the world will be blessed. Right here, God offers to make Israel a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Really, that priesthood idea, it's big. Again, this is something we'll get more into later on in the book of Exodus, but that's a task to make God known to the rest of the world, an intermediary type role, to represent the world to God and to represent God to the world. Really, this mission that Israel has that won't ultimately be fulfilled until the person of Jesus Christ, the great high priest, the one mediator between God and man of the nation of Israel. That is the offer of the covenant right here. God's salvation first, stipulation second, God's promises third. How the people respond, verse 8, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." So offer accepted. And then, with a breath of anticipation, the stage is set for what follows, the arrival of God. Verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak to you, and may also believe you forever. When Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments. Basically, wash your clothes, which if you've been in the wilderness for a long time, that's not easy. This is going to require hiking. It's going to require probably a lot of washing after all that walking. Wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, Take care not to go up into the mountain or to touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot, likely with a bow and arrow. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. Which is basically it's a euphemism for don't have sex. It doesn't, literally mean if you saw a woman, you had to kind of like keep a 15-foot berth, or whatever. This is an instruction for all the people. Verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord to look, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, Set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. In other words, God, you already gave us these instructions. So I really have to go back down and say them again, which I just love. After all this, preamble, smoke and all that, Moses still has, the chutzpah to argue with the God of the universe to his face, just like he did at the burning bush. This is remarkable. And just like at the burning bush, God is again patient yet firm. Verse 24, the Lord said to him, Go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And then here our chapter ends. Kind of abruptly, it might feel like for us today. All this preamble, all the pyrotechnics and thunder, the glorious presence of God himself stepping down onto the mountain, and then just as God walks up to the podium to begin this glorious declaration of the law, capital L, we as readers, we as a congregation, we're going to step away right here. Bruce is going to pick up right here next week. The voice of God from the slopes of Sinai, the 10 Commandments, all the commandments that follow. But I think it's kind of fitting for us today that we end with this sense of hushed anticipation, this sense of God's holiness, the fear of his presence, because really that is the purpose of this chapter. The whole point of chapter 19 is to set us up for chapter 20. The whole point of chapter 19 is to prepare God's people for the giving of the law by pointing them to the basis of the law, God himself, God the person, capital P. That's why God himself, he says he's doing all this in verse 9. Before all that stuff he does with the thunder, the lightning, all that, he says, "Behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever." In other words, I'm doing all this flashy stuff here, and I'm setting these boundaries around the mountain, with a penalty of death, the harshest penalty there could be, asking the people to wash their clothes and abstain from sex. All of that stuff is designed to establish the greatness of God, which is the basis of the law, his authority as creator to declare all of what is right and what is wrong, and the authority of Moses as the giver of the law to the people. You see all this and yes, this law is something we should listen to. This law is something we should follow because of who God is. That reason alone would be enough. God himself is the basis of God's law. That's what we see in Exodus 19. So, the question for us is, what do we miss out? What do we lose if we don't get this here? It's really the question that we began with, right? What do you lose if you have morality without God? What do you lose if you're all on board with the values of chapter 20 and those that follow, like not killing, not lying? That's great. Justice for the poor, all of that stuff. We love that. But what do you do if you skip over chapter 19 before that? The goodness and the holiness of the God upon which all of those commandments are built. What then will we lose? Well, there's three things that I'm going to suggest today. I think there's probably more than three things, but I'm just going to zero in on three today for us to kind of think about before we leave this chapter. Three problems for any system of rigid, absolute morality that does not have the living Creator God as its foundation. First, and most fundamentally, without God, we lose a transcendent, objective, universal, binding moral framework. There's a lot of qualifiers there, but they're all important for how we normally think about morality. What I mean by that, it really is that it's just, without God, it's really difficult to answer some of the most basic questions about morality, like, what is good? What is bad? Everywhere, for everyone. Why? These are questions that most people in our culture just, take for granted, like, of course, murder is wrong in all contexts, or torture, or rape. But can you really answer them apart from God? If so, how? This is a question that the British scholar, Rebecca McLaughlin is her name. She explores this question really thoughtfully in her recent book. I'm going to throw the picture of it up here. There it is. Confronting Christianity. The little print you can't read says 12 hard questions for the world's largest religion. And I'm putting this up here because I hope that some of you will think about purchasing this book. We're actually going to get a copy for the FBC library, so you can wait and try to beat everyone else to check it out, or you can spend $12 on it. I don't think that you would regret it. Because one of the hard questions that she looks at in this book, among 11 others, is the question of morality, like how do we get our moral frameworks, and whether or not you can argue for any sort of consistent, universal system of ethics apart from God. And the answer she comes to is no, you can't. At least not, right and wrong as most people understand it, as most people in our culture really assume is the case. For example, she points to one of the most fundamental moral values in our culture, which would be human rights. Almost everybody, if you just kind of stopped them on the street, would say, yeah, I affirm the value of human rights, that it's wrong to just kill or torture someone for no reason, that it's wrong to abuse women in any culture, any context, any period of history. Genocide is wrong. We'll say that is wrong. Black and white, or ethnic cleansing, that stuff is not okay. Human rights. But why? What standard or authority could you really invoke to make that claim? McLaughlin, she actually quotes an informational pamphlet that was distributed by ISIS a couple years ago. It's called Questions and Answers on Taking Captives and Slaves, and it provided for them, black and white, moral guidelines on how ISIS fighters should treat captives. Here's a quote that she uses. She says, question, is it permissible to have intercourse with a female slave who has not reached puberty? Answer, it is permissible to have intercourse with a female slave who hasn't reached puberty if she is fit for intercourse. Question, is it permissible to sell a female captive? Answer, it is permissible to buy, sell, or gift female captives or slaves, for they are merely property. Now, most in our culture would be repulsed by the answers to these questions. They'd be repulsed that the questions are even being asked. But if you were to confront the writers of this pamphlet about this, if you were to say, hey, what you guys are doing here is wrong, what standard would you appeal to convince them? What standard could you? What definition of right or wrong could you even point them to apart from your own opinion, or say, hey, this is the opinion of our culture. This is the opinion of our government. Are they going to listen to that? They're in a different culture. They're a different government. How can you say that stuff like this is wrong all the time, everywhere, apart from appealing to something transcendent, some standard from outside of our world, outside of humanity, that then governs our world, that governs humanity? The late atheist, Christopher Hitchens, he put it this way with refreshing honesty. He says, how do I know there's such things as human rights? I don't. I don't know there are such things. Our grounding for human rights is about as tenuous as our position as a primate species on a rather dodgy planet. Now, I'll tell you what, in like normal conversation, like if I'm talking to my neighbors about this, usually where someone will go, apart from God, to establish common ground in a moral conversation like this is by appealing to common sense, or appealing to like a common moral intuition. Something like, everybody knows that X is wrong, like slavery or rape, to use those ISIS standards. Regardless of your views on religion or politics or anything else, can't we all just agree on that certain moral truths are just self-evident, and that all reasonable people will agree with them, like human rights? Well, maybe, but maybe not. The more that you travel the world and interact with people from different cultures, different worldviews, the more that you look at history and just look at where things were 50 years ago, where things were 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. And the more that you look at that, the more you realize that, moral common sense is by no means common. That we're all products of our time and our culture, especially when it comes to the definition of human rights. Just last week, I saw this headline and it kind of blew my mind. The Saudi Arabian press agency announced via Twitter that the kingdom had executed 37 men on April 23rd for, quote, adopting extremist terrorist ideologies and forming terrorist cells to corrupt and disrupt security, as well as spreading chaos and provoking sectarian strife. It's a pretty broad and vague charge when you think about it, especially for a mass execution. One of these men, the tweet also announced, was executed by means of crucifixion. Crucifixion, 2019, announced via Twitter. I mean, look at history. Travel the world. Moral sensibilities are by no means common. When we say, can't we all just agree that X is wrong? That's what we're saying is almost always just a reflection of our broader context, how we were raised, the way that we see the world. Change the date, change the context, we'd all probably be saying something different. The person from Saudi Arabia, they might look at our Twitter feeds and just be shocked and aghast. They would look at what we see when we scroll through social media and what our friends and ourselves and our neighbors are tweeting and say, well, what are these Americans thinking? The decadence here, the disrespect, the immodesty. Can't we all agree that that's just wrong and immoral? So who's right? Who can say? A Duke professor and also an atheist, his name's Alex Rosenberg. He wrote a book in 2011. It's called The Atheist's Guide to Enjoying Reality, Enjoying Life Without Illusions. And so he's a philosophy guy, so it's based on his philosophy, but it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it represents for him kind of a sort of atheist Bible or manifesto. And here's what he says, kind of question and answer format again. He says, is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? Is there free will? Not a chance. What happens when I die? Everything pretty much goes on as before, except without us. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything else you don't like forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? His conclusion? Anything goes. Anything goes. Honestly, from a philosophical standpoint, this is where you end up when you try to ground morality apart from God. Whether it's cheating on your taxes or having intercourse with a prepubescent female slave, anything goes. And what standard could you invoke to say otherwise? Now, I want to be clear. This isn't to say that people can't live their own lives according to moral principles apart from God. They can, and they do. I mean, we see this all the time with our friends and our neighbors who are like honest, hardworking people who try to do their best to do what they think is right. But this is the important difference here. Apart from God, they can't call anyone else to do the same. At best, they can hold to a standard that is personal, that's for them, that's subjective, maybe changeable, nothing close to the kind of morality that says human rights are always valuable or rape is always wrong for everyone, everywhere. Notre Dame sociologist, he sums that distinction up well when he says, an atheist is perfectly entitled to believe in and to promote universal benevolence and human rights, but only as an arbitrary, subjective, personal preference, not as a rational, compelling, universally binding fact and obligation. So important to note that difference, because that right there is not how most people think about morality in our culture. That's not what most people say when they say that racism is wrong. That, it's wrong for me, but it's okay for you. That's not what we hold to. Is that consistent? This is what you lose when you lose God, the foundation for morality itself. Second thing we lose, that is, we lose a relational incentive to do the right thing. So, meaning God is not just the answer to what is right, like we look at God and we know, okay, this is right, this is wrong. No, He is also the answer to why should I do what is right? Always, all of the time. Like, think of that quote from the atheist Alex Rosenberg just before this. He touched on this. He said, why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Okay, fine. That incentive can work as far as it goes. Doing the right and the just thing usually does feel good. God designed it that way. It's more blessed to give than to receive. That's what Jesus said, and that's a perfectly valid reason to do the right thing. But what about those times when doing the right or the just thing doesn't make you feel good? What about those times when doing the right thing is painful? What about those times when doing the right thing is really a sacrifice with no benefits for you or for your clan or tribe, psychological or otherwise? What about when doing the right thing costs you your very life, your existence? What then? What incentive, can you point to or point others to do the right thing even when it costs you? That's why our passage today is so important. I think this really gets back to Moses' original intention for this. What we see when we look at this passage is the ultimate incentive for doing the right thing, and that is the fear of God. What we see of God in this passage is frightening. It should be. That's kind of the point. That's why God has, these people wash their clothes for 3 days. And it's why He puts these boundaries around the mountains that are so harsh, even that death penalty for anyone who comes near the mountain, even a goat or your cow that wanders up on the slopes of the mountain while it's grazing needs to be put to death. That is not acceptable. This is who we are dealing with here. This is the being on whom morality is based, a being so that it's so pure, so utterly other than us, that for us to step into the presence of his holiness would be like, that scene from the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, or a Crayola crayon that's tossed into a nuclear reactor or something like that. We're not built for that kind of holiness. We can't handle that kind of purity, that heat of this being who is so distinct from us. Yet this is the God with whom we relate when we make our moral decisions. This is the God that we offend when we do what is wrong. This is the God before whom all people must one day stand face to face in his presence to give an account. When we can't see any other reason to do the right thing, when doing the right thing will not benefit us, but it actually might harm us, the fear of God should be enough for us to do the right thing anyway. A little thought experiment here. I want you to think about the last time you kind of had a crisis point, or you had a moment where you were tempted to do something that you knew was wrong, according to the standards of God as revealed in Holy Scripture, but you wanted to do it anyway. And you thought, there's probably not going to be any benefits at all from me doing the right thing, and maybe a great payoff if I do the wrong thing. Like maybe it was to gossip about or slander, stab in the back some sort of coworker who was in your way for a promotion. And they'd never find out that you did this, but you could do it. Or maybe it's like if you've ever taken an online class, they usually have you do these things where you check the box. Yes, I read the chapter. Who's going to care if you check that box? Who's going to know? And you didn't actually read the chapter. Or on, a more serious level, you could be in a situation where you feel like you could have an affair with somebody and it would just be like zero consequences. Nobody would ever find out, totally secret, and you're just kind of toying with this idea in your head. Now, I want you to think about how you would face that temptation, that moment of crisis differently if you had lived through Exodus 19. If you had somehow been able to stand with the Israelites on the slopes of Sinai, if you could have heard the trumpet when it made the rocks shake, if you could have felt the heat from the flames of God's presence, if you could just stared at all in all of their glory, in all of his glory, the God of Sinai descending upon the mountain, the holiness of his presence. I think that each of us would know as never before exactly what the writer of the letter to the Hebrews says when he reflects on this very passage. He's looking back at Exodus 19, and his conclusion for Christians today is this: it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, for our God is a consuming fire. This is a powerful incentive to do what is right all of the time, even when it frightens you, because God should frighten you more. And yet there's another side to this relational incentive that might be easy to miss when you're looking at the kind of the end part of this chapter, because that's the part that really stands out to us. But you look at the beginning, you see a whole other side of this, and that is the kindness of God. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. The people declare this at the beginning of the chapter. It's beautiful. That is as broad of a blanket statement of obedience that you can make, right? Not, we'll obey God if it feels good. We'll obey God if his rules make sense to us and kind of, work for our life and our systems of logic. Not, we're going to obey God as long as it lines up with the values and sensibilities of our time period in history right now, our modern culture. No, this is an unqualified statement of unreserved commitment to God's moral standards before they've even heard them. Right? They haven't received the law yet. They say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. But do you notice where this statement comes in the story, in our chapter right here? It's all the way back in verse 8. This is, the beginning of the chapter. This is before the lightning. This is before the trumpet and the smoke and the fire and all that stuff. And it's right after just that beautiful reminder of the blessings of God's salvation that they have received and the blessings he will continue to pour out on them in the future. No threats, just grace. Look at verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptian and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among the people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is why the people make that statement there. This is why they say they're going to obey. It's not just because God is great and powerful, but because he is good. It's not just because God is holy, and he is, but it's because he's also kind. It's not just because they fear him, it's because they love him as he first loved them. You know, without a person, capital P as the basis of morality, we lose this relational incentive to do what is right, both sides of it, the fear of God and the love of God. And worst of all, the third thing we lose when we lose God as the basis of morality, we lose the beauty of grace. This is the single biggest problem with our culture's kind of new, rigid, black and white morality. It's the most terrible burden of rules without God. It's this gnawing question, what can I do with my guilt? What can I do with it? This is ultimately the question that the writer Samuel James brings up at the end of that article that I quoted earlier, that article where he observes, how young people in our culture have gotten so moralistic about stuff. He says, when you adopt this kind of moral standard, this moral absolutism, what you end up with, inevitably, is a whole lot of guilt for a whole lot of people and really nothing to do about it. There's guilt for the way that you've wronged others. There's guilt for the ways that you've participated in structures that promote evil or injustice. There's guilt for not living up to your own moral standards all of the time. Guilt for not doing enough to help others or to fight kind of the problems of our world. I mean, you name it. If you try to live up to an absolute moral standard for any length of time, you will come to the realization that you are a failure, that you can't do it. And when you know that you are guilty, where can you go with that? C.S. Lewis reflects on this very question way back, what was it, like the 1940s when he wrote Mere Christianity. He says, only a person can forgive, capital P. Only a person. Not a moral system, not a standard. Those things can't forgive you. Only a person can. And when you have rejected a personal being as the foundation of all morality, all right and wrong, where ultimately can you turn for redemption? It's a serious problem in our culture, and it comes out in the way we interact with each other, in our public discourse. As James writes, he says, the rituals of scapegoating, of public humiliation and shaming, of multiplying morally impermissible utterances and sentiments and punishing them with disproportionate severity, all are visibly on the increase in our public life. The gospel of Christianity offers new life through repentance and spiritual rebirth. There is no such gospel in the worldviews of secular students. The best that can be strived for in them is tribal purity, like making sure anyone we associate with sticks to our moral standards rigidly. In some, the modern campus culture is a religious culture, but it's a religion without God, and consequently, it is a religion without grace. This is the terrible burden of rules without God. The burden of failure, the burden of guilt, the burden of knowing there's nothing that you can ever do to truly make things right. Only a person can forgive. Only a person can say, it's all right, we're good now, it's okay, I love you. Only a person can mend a relationship with you. And in Jesus Christ, that is exactly what we get. The cross of Jesus Christ is the only answer and the final answer to the question of guilt. The cross of Jesus Christ is the intersection between God's holiness and God's love, the intersection of God's justice and God's mercy, right there on the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ is the only hope for sinful people, everyone, from everywhere, and all times. I love how the writer of Hebrews puts it. So he puts it so simply, yet so powerfully. He, Jesus, has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. That's the cross. That's the hope for guilty people. Once, he says, meaning this is complete. There's nothing else that you have to pay. It's done. For all, meaning this grace it is available to anyone who will take it. The person who wrote that pamphlet for ISIS to, the nice little old lady who lives down the street. This is available for anybody. For all. Your sin, your guilt, your shame, all that. It is put away forever. So, what this means, when we look at Exodus 19, this means nobody here has to wash their clothes for 3 days before approaching the presence of God. Nobody. Jesus Christ has washed them for us, and he clothes us in his righteousness. What this means is we don't have to be afraid to walk up the mountain, to stand in God's holy presence, that we're going to get blasted or killed or something like that, because Christ was already killed. There's no penalty left to be paid. He paid it. And we can now approach the throne of grace with confidence in Jesus Christ. What this means is that the God who made the rules, the God on whom every single rule is based, was willing to die for those who couldn't keep the rules. That is the beauty of grace. It's the beauty that this story that begins on the slopes of Sinai doesn't end at Sinai. It continues to the slopes of Calvary, where God the Son walked up the mountain for us, carrying a cross. This is why we need to worship. Pray with me, please. Father, what you have done for us in Jesus Christ, we can just begin to see the contours of it. But when we look into our own hearts, and when we look inside and see the selfishness, the sin, the uncleanness that should keep us away from you ever and always, that should keep us even from wanting to pray to you right now or sing to you in just a little bit, that is when we see the beauty of grace, that Jesus has made a way through the cross for us to approach you with confidence, to delight in you, and that by your Spirit, you empower us to live the way that we ought in lives that glorify you. Thank you for the hope of your grace, the grace that saves us, the grace that keeps us, the grace that empowers us to keep going. All through Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.